Hello and welcome to the August 23rd edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway. This episode is primarily going to be an interview with a member of our community, Roma, who was at the protests that we'd been talking about the last two episodes, basically every single day, with only a few exceptions, and is going to share with us the experience of being a part of that protest movement, what the feelings on the ground were as the political objectives of that movement evolved, as well as the organizational structure, or really lack thereof, that made up those protests. But first, I do still feel the need to do a small news update. There are a handful of topics I do feel need to be covered, but I'm going to go through them fairly quickly just because I want that interview to be the main focus of this episode. So just to begin with, I'll do personal update for those curious. My windows, which had been blown out in a missile attack, there is an Zircon missile that was intercepted right in front of my apartment that really kind of messed up the place. By now, the update on that for me is that my windows have been replaced. As it stands right now, my landlord was covering the actual repair and is waiting for the city to reimburse him for it. One thing that happens is that the city is supposed to pay for the repairs of damage during these attacks, but bureaucracy. So let's see how long that will take to do. However, this first topic that I need to be talking about is these attacks have been continuing, and they have been continuing in the absence of viable air defense, as we were talking about in the most recent episode. Not a complete lack of defense, some things are still being shot down, but without these Patriot missiles, a lot more is going through than it used to, and is causing a significant amount of damage. Civilian casualties continue to be extremely high. One example of one of these attacks that happened before I did this recording was in the city of Kryvyi Rih. It is in the kind of south central part of the country. It's in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, along with Dnipro and Zaporizhia. It forms kind of a industrial triangle in the lower Dnipro Valley of Ukraine, and that is the region which I entered the country in originally, where I first lived. So this Russian attack happened during the day on Friday on a mall when people tended to be at the mall. 14 people were killed in this attack, and it also included another double tap where after Russia strikes one area, it will hit it again to kill any survivors and especially first responders. So 14 dead, over 100 injured. And considering that many were in critical condition by the time you're listening to this, some more may be dead. With some very heartbreaking stories of especially the people who work in the mall and just people searching for their coworkers they got to know, working side by side with each other. A horrible, horrible crime, but a part of this ongoing trend right now of Russia targeting big box stores, malls, that kind of thing. And one effect of this is something that I noticed when I went to a hardware store recently to get glue as part of the attack. A big chunk of my wallpaper next to the windows was also ripped up. I was going to glue it back into place. But the epicenter, the store I would go to for that, was closed. Now, this is something that happened at the beginning of the invasion, where when there was an air alert, big stores, grocery stores would close. But that isn't really how an economy works. You can't just have your store closed half the day. So they kind of gave up on that idea for a while. But this time around, when I went to that store, the epicenter was closed during the air raid, because these epicenters in particular have been targeted many times recently, and they just didn't want to take the risk of people being in it if it is attacked. I don't know how long that decision will go, and in fact, at that time, there was an ongoing attack that actually had strikes in Kiev. There was a business center in Hlasivsky that was struck, was on fire. I posted a picture of the smoke from the fire going across the Motherland Monument, a very stark image, and that is happening during the day when things tend not to happen. So maybe it was just closed because things were literally already on fire in the city. So any further attacks could be on this store, or it could be a change of policy. We'll have to see going forward. The next bit of news to cover is an assassination in Crimea carried out by a Russian, actually, a Russian who had known sympathies to Ukraine. So the target of this assassination was named Robert Shigeev. Shigeev was a commander of a submarine in the Ukrainian fleet as it was held in Crimea before 2014 and the annexation. Both the Ukrainian Navy and the Russian Navy existed side by side in Sevastopol, sharing a lot of the naval infrastructure there. Now, the story of how these fleets came to be was actually the subject of a past Kiev Independent documentary that I narrated about how Russia tried to steal all of the Soviet fleet. Also, I'll put a link to that in the notes there about the backstory of how the naval situation in Crimea came to be. But point being, Shigeev was the commander of Ukraine's only submarine, the Zaporizhia. Now, this wasn't a great submarine and was in fact slated to become a museum piece at the time. But when Russia annexed Crimea, he had his orders to take that submarine to Odessa. However, instead of doing so, he defected to the Russian Navy, bringing the submarine with him. And for that, he was convicted of high treason in Ukraine. Literally stealing a naval ship and sending it over to the enemy is about as treasonous by definition as you can get. And since then has been an officer in the Russian Navy instead. And so we reach our assassin, who killed him. And that was a woman named Margarita Rut, 32 years old, from the city of Yaroslavl. Though she had lived in Sochi, a city in the Black Sea famous for hosting the Olympics. Margarita was a biologist by training, a woman in STEM, but in addition to her brains, she apparently also had beauty and really made her money as an escort. It apparently kind of fused these two halves of her careers together by selling floral vaginal suppositories, as it is being described. I didn't look into what this meant, but I assumed it was a goop type situation. The company, the wellness company of Gwyneth Paltrow does similar things, so maybe it's just a thing. But here we have, a trained scientist slash escort carrying out an assassination mission. Pure spy movie stuff. This is Bond girl things going on right now, which is really the kind of thing we've been missing out a lot of on various espionage stories. Whenever there's a story about, Russian spies creeping into Europe and doing an assassination, they always just turn out to be just dumb-looking Goombas. It turns out that the high-class, beautiful people carrying out international espionage is just a movie thing, and that always kind of made me sad because what do you mean that spies aren't cool and they're actually just dopes? Well, finally it works out as it does in the movies. And she had, in fact, been arrested and given a fine before for expressing her support for Ukraine. But also, she was apparently common showing in Crimea. She knew the place and I guess used her local knowledge to plant a bomb that exploded and killed this treasonous naval officer, Shigeev. She was quickly caught, and when she was given the chance to speak on this, she said that, of course, she had no regrets for her actions. So, a hero. Truly a hero. But unfortunately, as a hero, she is almost certainly going to go to a pretty nasty prison with horrific conditions. Next story is that there have been new updates to the ongoing anti-corruption investigations into members of the presidential administration. As an ongoing story, it had previously led to the resignation of Andrei Yermak and other investigations and charges brought of other members of the executive branch, especially the former Energy Minister Halushenko. These recent updates have dealt largely with a former Deputy Chief of Staff, Irina Mudra. As this investigation was looking into illegal practices around Ukrenergo, they discovered other corruption schemes involving basically the same group of people, mostly focusing around this concept of corporate raiding, which is where you fudge some documents, declare that a company or a property, something, some kind of legal entity or thing you can own belongs to you by forging some documents, working around some of the gray areas of ownership that exist in Ukraine that grew out of the privatization process, which was often extraordinarily complicated with lots of room to clip around the edges, we can say. And so this concept of raiding has been very common throughout the post-Soviet economies. And though this doesn't seem to be the case in anything they're saying now, in other instances of raiding, it has often been followed up by bringing a group of, as they say in news reports, athletic-looking young men, read gangsters, to just kind of show up at a property and just be real intimidating until the actual owner makes up his mind about whose documents are real or not, we can say. Though in this case, that does not seem to be the case. That's not what Mudra is being accused of. Just to give you the general idea of how raiding works. It is usually a legal process, but sometimes you bring in the thugs. And in particular, they're looking at a scheme where members of this clique were able to get a hold of Sense Bank. Now, Sense Bank is owned, or was owned rather, by a Russian oligarch who was born in Ukraine and prior to the full-scale invasion was quite involved in the Ukrainian economy. He was the owner of the Morshinska water company, like one of the most common water companies. He did the Lviv Jazz Fest and was the primary funder the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, as his own family had been killed in Babin Yar. Because again, his family, he himself was from Lviv, but he, like many people in the collapse of the former Soviet Union, made his money in Russia. And though Mikhail Friedman, I don't remember if I said his name or not, but Mikhail Friedman, he's been in a weird kind of position where vocally he has kind of been against Russia and against the war, but he is still Russia. It's complicated stuff, but basically all of his properties in Ukraine were confiscated as, an oligarch of the enemy invading country, including Alpha Bank. But this thing, Sense Bank, was apparently caught in a weird kind of position because actually a lot of oversight happens in the financial sector in Ukraine, especially after another oligarch, Ihor Kolomoisky, took essentially the largest bank in the country, Privat Bank, and used it as personal slush fund, stealing insane amounts of money. And that was the main thing that got him to become a bit of a persona non grata, as you would imagine, robbing that much money from the country's biggest bank. So after this incident happened with Privat, there had been a lot of controls put in place for other state-owned banks. Privat ended up being taken over by the state because, obviously, the private ownership had failed. And so the financial system in Ukraine had been pretty clean after that. And just speaking as a user, much better and more useful to use than the American banking system, I do have to say. But for some reason or another, Sense Bank found itself outside of a lot of these controls. This group within the presidential administration was able to take control of that bank as a part of the government, as a government-owned asset, and somehow were able to control it in a way that slipped by a lot of these otherwise pretty effective banking regulations. And they themselves used it to, as Kolomoisky did before them, embezzle a ton of money. And tying it into the Mindich case, used some of that money, a lot of that money, to pay the bail for the disgraced former energy minister. Apparently, if he had to stay in jail, he would have talked, as everyone always does, but because they paid his bail, it caused him to walk away without squealing to the anti-corruption cops. Allegedly. This is all for their legal purposes, allegedly. And then this was all tied into more news that Yermak, as everyone kind of understood, was still using his political influence to manipulate some things behind the scenes. His influence is not totally gone. Now, by the time we do our next news update episode, I would expect there's more information on this. This has all been coming out within the last 2 days. So when I do another news update in like 2 weeks or so, maybe 2-3 weeks, depending on how things come together with other episodes and the upcoming holidays, by the way, we may have more information to talk about in more detail. But that is the standing of this new update in the ongoing anti-corruption scandal that has been going on for the last since November. Yes, November. But I would say that it has been kind of hard to kind of pull together all of this because it is in fact multiple different stories going on at the same time, but with this connecting line of it all branching out of the NABU investigations. And the last thing is about a topic which I truly don't understand very well, so I can only give a very brief, very brief summary of, but is something I would very much like to delve into in the future because it is so fascinating. So, this war has been marked by the rapid advance in the use of drone technologies. In 2022, a drone was often just a commercial drone that you could get from your local Best Buy with a grenade attached to it. Very kind of rudimentary, very garage tinkerer kind of stuff. To now, they are the primary weapon, and it's used in so many different ways. There's ground drones, resupply, a medevac, FPV, fixed wing, all types of various drones used in all types of capacities in ways that evolve every month. If you were updated on how drones worked in January of this year, they work differently now. So you would think that there would be a lot of attention paid to what's going on with that. But everything I see from the US military, from a lot of places, is that these lessons aren't really being internalized. In some ways, I can understand this. If you're an American military technology developer, you're looking over at Ukraine and you're seeing that drones are being updated all the time. If you're going to begin a defense procurement plan in the US, it can take a very long time to go from the beginning of development to actual sale. But the time it would take to do that, considering the current pace of developments, by the time that you develop, okay, there's explosions outside, but I want to continue this. Get it done. All right. So by the time, I'm a bit jumpy. Okay. But by the time that this process happens, your product's already outdated, and there's been, actually going to hit pause. Never mind, that was lightning. I probably need a break. But anyway, so by the time that this process happens, your drone's already out of date. Different military technology companies often show up in Ukraine. I think they haven't been behaving themselves very well. They will often basically abuse the knowledge of Ukrainian soldiers without really adequately compensating them for that. But that's a whole other topic. But the United States has been giving a go at creating an unmanned assault battalion. This was an attempt to integrate drone warfare into the way that America figures out its tactics, what a soldier is supposed to do, and essentially learn the lessons that the Ukrainian military has already learned. There had been a lot of developments in this unmanned assault battalion, actually, and it was ready to begin military exercises. However, there is a little bump in that plan. as this was the project of the former Army Chief of Staff, General Randy George, as well as the former commander of U.S. Army Europe and Africa, General Christopher Donahue. And both of these men were just fired. This is a part of the Defense Department's broader strategy of purging the military leadership. They've been firing a lot of generals. And they had working relationship with the Secretary of the Army, Driscoll. And because I'm not doing a deep dive or anything right now, suffice to say that there is a hunt for disloyalty going on in the upper echelons of the U.S. military. And so there's two things happening with the canceling of this drone unit. One, apparently the U.S. military under Hegseth does not care very much about the future of warfare. He sees a bunch of drone techs and is wondering why they aren't doing cool obstacle courses with him. That's what he loves. He likes doing obstacle courses and rappelling out of helicopters as the defense secretary. Too many things I'm holding in about my anger towards this man. I'm going fast. And the second half of it is, just this internal purge within the United States military to the whims of Hegseth. So I would like to definitely look in the future of how the United States and other militaries are learning the lessons from Ukraine. But in this story, it seems like they're not that interested. Anyway, on with this interview. Roma, a member of our Patreon community, by the way, so patreon.com/Ukraine without hype, in order to join our list of supporters. In the future, actually, I would like to start a rather specific fundraiser for gear. My own armor is quite out of date, quite heavy, and essentially, as soon as I get a green light from the doctors, I would like to get back out into the field, and to do that, I would prefer to do so with better armor that would protect me better and would not be so encumbering. That will be a couple of $100s. I live frugally, and so that is a large expense to me and one I have been putting off. So I'll be kind of passing around the plate for anyone who will be interested in that. I have not started that yet. I would like to have a specific list of things I will buy before I do so, and that will require some research as to the best that I can get, the best value I can get, so that I'm not, asking for special forces assault level 6 armor or nothing like that. I'm not gonna get you to pay for, the tier 1 class S type stuff, but I would like to have a specific list, and that list could take a minute to put together. But so there will be a fundraiser in the near future, probably about a week for that. So I would appreciate any help. It will be treated as an empty bowl. I will be saving for it anyway. It'll just help in that process. I'll also be doing some medical trainings. I'm going to try to get into a drone survival training. I have not been in the field for a minute, and I would like to be prepared. Anyway, so on with this interview. Roma, I hung out with him at these protests a bunch. He was explaining to me how things were going on at the time. Some good anecdotes in there. But without further ado, Roma. And to round out this episode, we have an interview for you regarding the end of the protests that lasted for about a month. So about a month ago, there was announced that the Defense Minister Fedorov was sacked as part of an overall government reshuffle. And this made a lot of people very angry. Again, you can go back to our previous 2 episodes for the extensive details of what that protest meant, and then some of the updates on it in the most recent episode. But for this one, the protests are now over, or at least the main part of the protest. We'll get into the future of them in this interview. And with us today will be Roma. Roma is a friend of ours as well as a member of the Patreon. So patreon.com, Ukraine without hype. Roma is wise enough to join our Patreon community, and so can you, I guess. So Roma, can you introduce yourself?
I don't know what to describe myself. I am an active member of civil society in Ukraine, I guess. I'm originally from Luhansk, but I've been living in Kyiv for last 10 years. More than that, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And the fact that you are from Luhansk was, I believe, the reason that you got that television interview at that last protest that I was at?
But yeah. Well, I didn't get it actually. I just had a guy recognize me. Yeah, he's common at other protests. He was also at the traffic fair protests, so like we know each other a bit. He is just an old guy who is into young people speaking their minds, and he's like talking to every press member, like, go talk to this guy, to this guy. They have a lot to say.
All right. So, can you give in your own words how you saw the start of the protests? Like, what brought you out? Because you were there basically every day, to my understanding.
I have skipped 3 days as far as I remember. Yes, I was there since day one. I have a strong feeling, strong reaction against any decision that government tries to rush through and like quickly push and for it to be late to discuss it since it's all already done, because those decisions are never good. So I was already dubious about that, and then I looked into like the ousting of Fedorov, and that the new guy was the chief of the police who is connected with like old ideas of how to fight the war, and also the call to the protest was by Dmitro Kozyatinsky, who called for Nabu protests last year, so I decided I would go to the square and see what it's all about. So in the morning on the 16th of July, I came there and stayed there since. The protests changed their like outline and what they were about over time. Because initially they were framed as a conflict between Syrsky and Fedorov, and there was a big anti-Syrsky angle, and there was some people from the military who spoke that, like, I don't personally like Fedorov, but I dislike Syrsky, and we need to get Syrsky out, so now is the chance. I had friends who are in the military telling me basically that. And when Syrsky was out, it kind of changed the direction of the protest. It decreased their popularity because a lot of people took it as a win, so, like, we're done, even though the key demand was to bring Fedorov back, and that was not achieved. And it also made this complicated for Fedorov and for the protests as well, because initial conflict was very clear. The protest was against old ways of Syrsky. Syrsky was connected to a scandal with Scalia and abuse of the soldiers there. Syrsky was connected to like meat assault type warfare, and Fedorov was in minds of many people connected to technology development, drones and stuff. So it was clear old versus new, personality versus personality, and it wasn't against the government. So for a bit, well, not directly against the president, for a bit, Fedorov was outspoken and he named, like, he hinted at people in the military tech sector, like, being against him being there at his conflict with Syrsky. But once Syrsky was out, Fedorov couldn't frame it as, like, anything other but conflict against the president, because there was nothing else stopping him from getting the job back. And he decided not to do it until the late stage of the protest, when it was, in my opinion, too late to do anything. And when the protests needed support of Fedorov, he was dodging the question. Whenever he was asked, like, what should the protesters do to give you your job back, he, like, shifted, he changed topic, he dodged the question.
So, was there like a demand that Fedorov join the protest? Did you feel that there was actual disappointment from this, or was the organization largely separate from Fedorov himself? Like, what was the expectation that people wanted?
It's diverse. There is a common misconception that the protests are too organized, but they are very grassroots and horizontal, and it has its downsides. There are people who walk around with loudspeakers and they have different opinions, and you can tell the vibe shift based on who is there today and who isn't. Most people, of course, demanded the government to do anything, but there was some talking. It wasn't a chance because we were demanding from the president and from the administration. We weren't demanding from Fedorov. But I've heard some people say that, like, why wouldn't Fedorov come to support of the protests? when Fedorov had that, he gave several interviews. Initial one was, I think, like a conference where he said why he was fired in his opinion. Then he went to Ukrainska Pravda and talked more about that, and it was more neutral because Syrski was already out. And then he went to Sternenko, and on Sternenko's live stream, the viewers could submit questions and ask Fedorov what he thinks on that. And a common question was like, what should protests do? Why don't you publicly state your support? It wasn't like very repeated by Sternenko because there's no point in asking it over and over. But this was a voiced question. At that point, he wasn't in conflict with Zelensky, at least publicly, and he voiced it like protesters should be speaking out about how to fight the war, not in support of me, not in support of me getting the job back, but protesters should speak about the proper way to fight the war, which was kind of silly in my opinion. Like, the people in the square can voice a specific demand, but we are not supposed to have like a point by point plan or strategy brainstormed in the square.
Yeah, you're not the chiefs of staff out on the square there. But you mentioned how things could change by the day of whoever is holding the loudspeaker at a given time. So what was the actual organization of these protests like? Like, how was it decided where to show up and when?
So the place, to my understanding, was mainly decided by Dmitro Kazatinsky. He is a veteran. He worked as a medic in the ULF unit under Da Vinci Wolves, and he is a soldier who called for Nabu protests last year. So he has a big platform on Twitter and probably somewhere else. I don't follow him on other platforms. But his call was loud. But he wasn't always present on the square. He was there for the big days. And I don't remember him speaking into the microphone or into the loudspeaker much. He is a person with big public platforms that can call for the protest. And on the days he called for, people showed up.
Yeah, it really reminded me a lot of Mustafa Dayam at the beginning of Maidan.
Yeah, there is similarity.
Where he did the Facebook post of "Come out to the square, we're going to do this," but he's
and
not.
Then he didn't direct. He just like voiced a call. There were, I guess, people in the square with loudspeakers, and on the first day there wasn't really an organization, and you could feel it. People were like brainstorming the chants, and you had different parts of the square chanting different things because like one part agreed with the chant, the other didn't, and like they overlapped with each other. It wasn't as coherent. There were issues. Then people with loudspeakers started showing up. I don't know the details of how it was initially decided, but eventually it was the same like group of people. I know them basically by names now, and they differ in opinions. There is a guy from Mariupol, a soldier who was taken captive as a defender of Azovstal and spent 3 years in captivity and got exchanged back. And he is more of a right-leaning guy who was often calling for attention to the prisoners of war, calling people to pay attention to Free Azov demonstrations, and was pro people getting educated on their rights because it's harder to rule over people who are uneducated. There is a musician, a guy most people recognize as a leader of a protest, named Zahar. He has a cardboard sign on his back with like cringe written on it. And he is usually drumming and chanting, and on the marches, he was the one leading the protest. And he's like a very moderate guy. Whenever there was any call for radicalization of the protests, whenever people got like angry that the government isn't hearing them and they need to do more, he was correcting. He was like, we need to function within constitution. We cannot. This would hurt the defense effort. We cannot do that. He was the one organizing constitution reading on one day when we had a law expert explain like articles of the constitution and what rights people actually have. He was a very a moderate voice. On the last day of protest, when Fedorov called for an election, spoiler, I guess, he was correcting and saying that we cannot do elections. I do not support this. He was very openly saying that we are not for that. We don't support this call. There are others who are not as opinionated. They have different viewpoints. There are people who care a lot about holding minutes of silence for the fallen and when is more correct to call those. There is a guy from Poroshenko's party. He's not an important figure in the party. He's a minor member of a youth parliament from Gorlovka, actually, around Donetsk. And he voices more anti-Zelensky slogans. They're not necessarily incorrect, but you can tell he's a Poroshenko stan. You can tell by the way he talks, by the way the chants are recognizable. That's what I'll say. And that actually caused a little bit of a conflict later on with other speakers. There is another organizational part. There is social media part. There is a blogger who is walking around filming, and there is chat, I guess, where they upload the videos from the protests that are shot people chanting from the angle where the protest looks larger, but that's not in using. And then the bloggers friendly to the protests use those videos and post them. You could see different bloggers who use the same videos from the same person filming on the square. So there's that connection.
So you mentioned that there were these conflicts between ways of messaging things. How were these conflicts resolved? And was there much tension there? When I was there, it seemed pretty straightforward. Sometimes one guy would be a bit more insistent on the loudspeaker or something, but it didn't seem like a real conflict-ridden kind of place. So how were these things kind of sorted out?
The biggest one was between, as I mentioned, the Poroshenko member Arkady Petrosyan and a military veteran. He's not leader of the protest, but he was there basically every day. His name is Volodymyr. He was also on different protests for Kyiv transit fare rise. So when he was accused of being a provocateur, I didn't buy it because he visits other events and he's consistently for the same thing. And the conflict, this military veteran is very much in favor of civil society organizing and the parties being for the people and not around personalities and people power, people knowing how to legally demand things, constructive dialogue, not empty chants, mistakes of previous protests movements, what were some Maidan failures, and etc. And he saw a member of Poroshenko party being there and their slogans as an attempt to pivot the protests towards becoming politicized in sense that it's pro one party against another. And he had 10-minute long speech on 14th of August. It was one of the big days. And he wasn't cut off. He had a mic. He spoke his mind. Some people booed a bit. The other loudspeaker people, when he accused them directly of pivoting the protest, said we let you speak. We are not paid or whatever. And eventually the crowd, when it got tiring and repetitive, started chanting over the guy. So he left the square. But from top down, there wasn't an attempt to kick him out. Then they resolved in the back between each other and with involvement of police of dialogue. And an hour later, he went to the mic again and spoke, and they seemed to not have issues. They said that they resolved it. And 2 days later, he was there again, speaking his mind into the microphone, calling for civil society to self-organize. His chants were very formulated, but too long. He was chanting the people exercise their power self-sufficiently or something like that, and it doesn't fly off your tongue.
Not
exactly.
very snappy, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one thing that I commented a lot on during the Nabu protests last year on this podcast was how traditionally in Ukraine, a lot of these protests were very much connected to particular political or civil society forces. You had your right wing, your liberals, like you could kind of tell what a protest was by who was organizing it, like veterans organizations, whatever. But I remember, especially before COVID, that being one of the main things. Like, this is a protest for this group for this purpose, and there was working together between groups, but pretty organized. Whereas with the Nabu protest, it seemed to have no organizational structure and visibly anyway, no participation by like political parties or NGOs or things like that. So was this the case with these protests? Was there like any formal structures there even? Besides this one guy who's like loosely connected to Poroshenko?
Yeah, very minorly. He ran for something in 2019 and didn't get it. And like, to larger extent, no. There was this one point where an NGO spoke out, and a person from an NGO, Zmina, her name is Hanna, she was visiting most of the protests as a journalist covering them. She was the one who interviewed the homeless person there who participated in both this protest and the previous one for Nabu, and he was very into keeping the cardboard safe. So she spoke at the microphone on the day after one of the moderators of the chat for like organizing the protests, basically just informing when to walk. There wasn't anything more structural there. That person was arrested on grounds that he was a soldier who went AWOL. And a post from his account was made into the chat that he, like, I'm acting wrong, I made a decision, I'm joining the military, and he deleted the chat. They had to make a new one. And he later claims that he didn't make this post, that the person who arrested him used his phone and posted from his account. So at this point, the member of Zmina NGO, Zmina is Change in Ukrainian, spoke out that they will provide legal aid to anyone who feels persecuted or pressured by any means from the government or the military or anything. And if they're having any issues of the sort, they should come to her and talk, or that this is her contact phone, go for it. That was the extent of involvement of NGOs, I'd say.
So throughout this, you've been talking about some of the characters here. Other than these loudspeaker folks, where were some of the more, I guess, charismatic or notable regulars? I know this one homeless guy was there a lot. Like, can you explain his story or any other stories?
Yes, certainly. The homeless person, his name is Igor. He is displaced person from Zaporizhzhia. I do not know the full story of his. I read the interview, but it's not as easy to follow a conversation with him, to be honest. He is a bit over 50 and he lives on the street in Kyiv. He is an active participant in various protests around Kyiv, like in Friazov protests, I guess you should call them, in Nabu protests and in this protest, because they're on the same square. And like, he's very concerned with what young people say. It should stay preserved. So he is into preserving their signs as a form of self-expression. Every day he laid the signs from the previous day on the grass in the park, and then in the evening he would get them together and hide them. Initially he did so in the fountain, but one day the city garbage collectors came and picked the signs from the fountain and threw them away. And since then, he figured out a spot like behind the memorial, under the trees, where nobody touches them. And for 4 weeks, people have been, after the end of the protests, everyone gathered and helped Ihor to put the signs into the boxes and carry them under the tree and cover them with water-repellent cover so the rain won't ruin them. And he was an active protester as well. He went into the crowd and like banged two styrofoam blocks against each other and chanted the chants. And whenever any chant was repeated on a sign that laid around, he picked it up and like waved it around. He was very enthusiastic, but you could also tell that living on the street has affected his mind state. Sometimes when you talk to him, you can see him like going on a rant that is kind of hard to follow, that he's like on his own wave. And other people and other regulars. Were people who came and baked pancakes for the protests because there were, as there are always, there are accusations of protests being paid and organized, and that we are all on the paycheck from Fedorov. So it quickly became a joke, and there were regular people who would come, first of all, to give out food as a joke payment. So there were people who baked pancakes and waffles and came with like...
I feel like I should probably explain this. So during Maidan, Victoria Nuland, U.S. diplomat, was pictured handing cookies out to protesters. And somehow, in a way I don't quite understand, that was seen as the ultimate proof that the U.S. government orchestrated everything. And there's some implication that like there was something in the cookies. I don't know. I never quite understood what the conspiracy theory was, but it somehow morphed into its own idea, especially in like weird tanky parts of the internet of Victoria Nuland's cookies were the thing that drove Euromaidan.
There's actually deeper lore to that. The thing that something is in the cookies is from the Orange Revolution, not Euromaidan. It was said by Lyudmila Yanukovych, the wife of Viktor Yanukovych, that the people were handing out oranges and oranges were syringed, like there was heroin in the oranges and everyone was like eating and getting high, and that's how the fervor of the protest was going on. It's like an ongoing narrative. So yes, there were people handing out food as a joke salary, and like there were signs on the boxes with food like paycheck. And also there were people who printed out like monopoly money, basically, like cardboard Bank of Ukraine, 6-7 hryvnias. It's like an actual note that would be given out, and like you could take it as a joke, like 2,000 crazy bee candies, etc. And there were people printing out signs of like this, the number of the day of the protest, and like some joke around it. And it was done by the same people regularly. There was a corner with food and water and chargers for participants, as well as spare blank cardboard and like markers and sticky tape in case you need to construct your thing. So, and it was also done by pretty much the same people, except some swapped out between days because, you know, work and stuff. And there were other regular visitors in terms of... I made some like friends at the protest. There were a lot of people from Luhansk actually. There was a guy who came with Luhansk flag around his back every day. As you mentioned, the old guy who like called me out on being from Luhansk is also a regular on all protests. His name is Alexander. He's very anti-governmental, but he has like what's in English called, I guess, co-worker political beliefs. Like I couldn't put them on the political compass thing. I couldn't figure out from which angle he's going.
Median voter is what we say.
Yeah, median voter. There were people who sang songs every day, who read poetry every day. It was very artsy on some days. Whenever the crowd was singing out, there were people who spoke every day, and it was similar. There were people with different causes actually trying to attach themselves to this protest. When we were at the Long March, you noticed the old grandma holding like a big sign. She was protesting. She was from Kremenchuk region, as far as I remember. Kirovograd region. She was from Kirovograd region. She stayed sleeping in the Kyiv subway. And she was protesting like ahead of a medical psychiatric commission in her region because she accused him of bribery and embezzling 16 million hryvnias. And she had like a long sign and court decisions and her cell phone. And she wasn't in any way connected to the cause of the protests, but she was like adjacent and she came every day. And since it's democratic and we didn't kick her out, she just stayed there. She became a regular face on the square as well.
Yeah, a lot of things were attached to it. One of the things I was focusing on last episode actually was how various, I guess, protest streams, various civil society causes were kind of converging on these protests and diversifying some of the messages there. So I know at the same time there was the protests against the rise in public transit fares, as well as some nature preserve area having trees cut down. So how much of that was involved in the Fedorov protests? And do you think that there's some kind of broader base of political action here?
I've seen people at intersect. I've seen people from one protest as another and vice versa. So yes, there were 3 protests happening at the same time. You've named them. And the transit fare protests were mainly organized by like lefty student direct action union. And I think I saw 3 kids from that on the square, and like Alexander, as previously mentioned, and another old guy who came. Uh, they were like young and progressive, and protests started on the day they had their protest. Like 16th was also when they had the protest in front of the Kiev city administration. And from that point, they were shouting out that like there's also this other important protest, and if you have spare time, you should also go there. And some went. But from the other hand, I've met with a couple people there who spoke against going there because they saw it as pointless. I had a long conversation with 2 people there who said that this is like interpolitical, this is high offices going against each other, while the issue of transit price is very direct and understandable to them. But Fedorov versus Syrsky versus Klimenko versus Khmara, they don't know those names and they don't want to figure it out and they don't want to go there. So that was their angle. And there was surprisingly one nationalist at the Kyiv fair protest who said that like right-leaning forces should join and stand for the cheap fare because we had a counter protest going on then. And also that he judged people who were going to Fedorov protests because it was all hype and like they should instead be going to the Free Azov demonstrations because there aren't so many people while this protest is so popular and fancy. And I don't know, he was bitter, I guess.
It should be worth noting that there was just a prisoner release just a couple days ago, and very notably, nobody from Azov, none of the defenders of Mariupol who are still imprisoned were a part of that exchange. So that is very much a part of the political discourse right now of some people being left behind in Russian captivity while others are being traded. These issues with the negotiations over prisoner release are real. I don't know how to get into them because obviously they're getting some people out, and the Russians are probably more likely to trade away random soldier number 3 rather than an Azovstal defender because that's a PR win essentially on Ukraine's part. But I definitely understand where these Free Azov protesters are coming from because this is one of several exchanges where none of theirs got out. So yeah.
True. And with the protest for a green zone in Kyiv, there was an old forest in Kyiv that was chopped illegally and against city organization plans to build a heating pipeline for the winter emergency situations. It was originally planned to go by the street and not damage the tree preserve where some trees were over 100 years old. But one day, like when these protests are in their usual stage, there usually is about 10 people. And so on one of those days, police came, dragged people from the streets when they were hugging to prevent the chopping, hurt the people, some report bruises. And there was a video of police dragging the protesters that got pretty viral. And so a call to visit those protests was voiced in the Franka Square, so these 2 protests are interconnected directly. People went there more on the green angle. I saw lefty student union people come, but also there were some more right-leaning and patriotic-minded people, because you could see an angle to defend the green areas of the capital even from a nationalist stance. In fact, there is an area in Kyiv, Protasiev Yar, that was a passion project to defend for Roman Ratushny, who is a hero of Ukraine, who died on the front in, I think, 2022. And since then, it became a project for people of all political leanings to preserve this area from like illegal construction efforts and keep it as a green preserve, because it is something he wanted.
Yeah, there's just the Protasiev Yar festival about a month ago, 2 months ago, in the honor of Roman Ratushny and his brother, by the way, who was also killed on the front. Because they were connected to preserving this nature reserve, there is also a ski hill there, but the area around it's like hilly, not super construction
Yeah, it's
developed.
not too fancy. It's like not a national park or anything.
Yeah, but there's like nature trails and all that in there, but that was
Yeah, like
his
it looks nice, but
time.
there's also like a garage some guy built there in the 80s, and it's like it could use renovation efforts, but not mass scale construction.
Yeah, not the big. I guess it was supposed to be an apartment block they tried to build there.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't
yeah.
know, but
There was an
point
apartment
being,
block.
there was this festival, and the feel of the festival was very kind of progressive lefty feeling in a way, because there's no poetry readings. I don't know how popular poetry readings are at nationalist rallies, but it was very poetry heavy. Let me tell you, lots of poetry going on. And the Crimean Tatars were there. It was very much a joint ideological effort. So something environmental. Everyone has an interest in keeping the environment like clean and preserved for the future. I
Except
wish
our
that
mayor,
Americans had done
apparently.
that, except the mayor. That's one political. The one political leaning you could have is corruption, I
Yeah.
suppose. But as you're describing all this all seems so disconnected, so kind of disorganized, and there's always the question of how you have a larger action out of that. So most of the days you would go there, there'd be a few dozen people, maybe like 100 people or something.
Yeah,
But there
about
were these
100, yeah.
Yeah, but then there were these days where there would be a massive showing. The march, there's two really big marches I can think of. The most recent one a couple days ago, where we went past the began at the Friendship of Nations Monument. I don't know what that's called now. What
Arc
used
of Freedom of Ukrainian Nation, or Liberty of Арка свободи українського
the
народу.
Arc. Okay, yeah. So from the Arc to the square, going past the government sector. And then before that, there was another one. And then how do you get those really, really big protests that get, thousands of people marching in one direction from this milieu that is largely disorganized? Like, where do those calls come from, and why do people listen to them?
So I can see several reasons for why those days were big. For one, all of them were Fridays. That's like a big one.
Of course.
Another is that they were announced in advance. The first march from Taras Shevchenko Memorial to the square was announced, I want to say, on Monday, like 5 days ahead. And it kept being reposted and revoiced by all voices adjacent to the protest. All of those big days were announced by Dmytro Kozyatinsky. It was another big reason. I think there were some big like cultural figures that said something in favor, so it was also their outreach. And the regular protests, to be compared to that, they are same day, every day, same time, 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock. You do the same thing, you chant the same slogans, and like for most people, why come? So there is planning, there is an outreach from public, and yeah, it being announced in advance. In fact, it's not as organized, and I can like attest to that, because on the pre-last day of the protest, on 18th of August, when Parliament got back in session and we protested in front of the Parliament, and For the next day, they scheduled the vote for Khmara. And I stood next to the organizers that were present, who were brainstorming for like an hour what to do, how do we get people to come tomorrow. And they were pretty doomer. They were not really optimistic about it. And they discussed like where do they get voices, and that they don't have direct like call line to Kazyatinsky, that like he makes a call, but then it's up to them to organize the square if it's not a big event. And he wasn't present at 19th. As far as I remember, he said that like he's okay with Khmara being appointed. He wants dialogue, so it was not his cause. So organization is not as structured, and the publicity is just achieved by big social media figures. And how long of a time you have to voice it so people notice. Because another issue on 18th was that when we had to announce the next protest, it was like 6 in the evening, and you'd have to come at 9 the next day. Like the odds of people who needed to see it just not opening their Twitter or Instagram on time were really high.
So that brings us to the end of the protests, or I guess you can explain how much of an end it is. Basically, on a political level, everything is concluded. Some of the demands of the protests were met, some of them were not.
It's important to state the demands and which were met, which were not. Initially, the person appointed as a new Minister of Defense was Klimenko, but he refused to take the job because there were not enough voices, not enough votes, and he just declined. And he ended up in the National Council of Defense, whoever knows what that is or what they do. And then there was Fedorov, the new person was temporary executive. I think it's in English, it's acting Military of Defense, Khmara, because parliament was already in recess, and they couldn't vote in a new candidate until 18th of August. So for a month, we had an acting Minister of Defense who couldn't legally become a Minister of Defense because he was a member of the military. He had to like quickly leave the office on 19th before being voted in officially. So initially the conflict was between Syrsky and Fedorov, and the protests demanded to get Syrsky out, and also that the new general in charge should be Drapati. That was achieved, so that's an accomplishment of the protests. However, the government never officially stated like that is why it happened. According to Zelensky, Syrsky was a great general, and then he decided to fire him because, and Drapati is a great general, so he decided to put him into the job. And the protests are never mentioned in the official communication. Another demand was to put Fedorov back in, and connected to that was that parliament should get back sooner. That was not accomplished. Parliament came back into session on 18th of August as planned previously. So for a month, people were asking for that, didn't happen. People demanded Fedorov got his job back, didn't happen. People demanded Khmara would stay in SBU, didn't happen. And people demanded a clear communication and dialogue between president and the populace, that Zelensky would directly answer, not via speeches, but via conversations. It was one of the chants. That there needs to be a direct way to ask a question and get an answer, and not a way for him to dodge a question. Because, as some know, Zelensky hasn't held a media conference in 1.5 years, and like during this year, he gave more interviews to Laura Loomer than to Ukrainian press, and it's like rather annoying.
Yeah, on a point of that, Kiev Independent journalist Danila Mokrik, I've worked with him on some of the documentaries I've done at Kiev Independent. He put in an official like petition for Zelensky to hold a press conference, a thing that he just hasn't done. And this petition was rejected on like technical grounds.
Yeah, and
Like,
does
they
not
said it
fit
wasn't filed
the
correctly or
demands
something.
or something like that.
Yeah.
Same with petition to reinstate Fedorov, by the way. So that's on the main demands. The other two connected requests were when Umerov was appointed as intelligence chief, the demand was to get him out because he is a part of the Mindich investigation. He is tied to corruption, not really popular, and also has no qualification to do the job. He is just a person that Zelensky trusts and who can go do negotiations. And this has nothing to do with the job of intelligence minister. And another demand was that Vitaly Kim, who is now the head of Veterans Affairs, that he's not a veteran, so he shouldn't be on that job. That was another demand. None of them were addressed, mentioned, or even discussed. That's about demands. How it ended? On 34th day, on 18th of August, in the evening, after the protest in front of the parliament, people went also into the square to show up and get as many people as possible informed that they should come in front of the parliament on the next day because the vote will be held. And at 9:30 in the evening, Fedorov releases a video address where he calls, or at least implies a call for an election. That how long should we keep holding Ukrainian democracy hostage to Russia? We need to hold an election, so on.
Yeah,
I don't think it's clearly stated.
it was described a lot on social media saying he was calling for elections. Technically, what he was doing was saying that we should find a way to have elections if this is going to go on for 5-10 years.
Yeah, but
I
he's
think it was
the
still
highest approved.
it was definitely shaking some wasps' nests with that statement. It is very politically sensitive. Like on this show, we've talked about why that's a bad idea so many times.
He even mentioned most of those reasons. He listed this is why, this is why, this is why, and then he's like, but we still can. This basically pulled the carpet from under the feet of the protesters because now chanting in support of Fedorov was politically dubious. And so on the next day, there was basically a brainstorm to invent the new cause. People still, by inertia, kept calling for Fedorov to get his job back, but realistically, that ship has sailed. And other than that, they demanded independence of parliament, clear communication, and the main one, to vote against Khmara. And that was the only cause left. And everyone became very concerned with Minister of Defense being a civilian, as stated in the constitution. So this last call kicked the ground from under the feet of the protesters. They had to reinvent the message. Some people who regularly came were very disappointed in this message by Fedorov, and they didn't show up. And he kind of shot himself in the foot. But in my opinion, by 18th, 19th, it was already a done deal that this would be voted in and nothing would happen. And Fedorov just tried to turn this move into political capital, I guess. So after this, Khmara gets voted in. He becomes Minister of Defense. People yell shame and show their disappointment and go away. And then the same evening, they show up in the square to, as was described in the chat, discuss what to do next. Currently, the number is dwindling. There is another meeting scheduled tomorrow, actually, at 7 in the square, where people have to show up with a sheet of paper where they have printed out what do we want from this movement, what do we stand for, what is our plan, point by point, clearly, so a 10-year-old could understand. So there are people in the chat who are very stubborn and saying that we cannot give up because this is what they want. But when they get asked, okay, but what are we standing for? What do we demand? They get kind of lost. It is general slogans, and when they get asked directly, do you want to ask them to get Khmara out and Fedorov back in? They dodge the question because that's not possible, honestly. There are people still holding on to that, basically, who are and they are trying to turn this into some political cause, but it's still being shaped. It's still not exactly figured out what it is.
Yeah, the kind of concept we've been using since the Nabu protests here has been, the return of politics, is that, political demands don't end, and in fact, in such a extreme situation that we're in right now, it can only develop more urgent demands that can be made from the populace on the government. But in the absence of elections, there's no formal way you can do that except protest. The Nabu protest more or less worked, and we've seen the last year of a pretty intensive anti-corruption actions by Nabu as a result of those protests working. And now we're in this situation of it coming down to actual political figures, like Fedorov the person, Hmara the person, and their jobs being the question of street politics, and that didn't seem to work out very well. But there has to be some kind of outlet for people's political demands to be made when there isn't the technical accountability of being voted out of office. So what is the general feeling of what can be done in the future if there is at all?
So about that, I generally agree, but a key distinction between NABU and this protest is that NABU was a demand by European Union on the path to membership, and not going in that direction had a direct pressure from Europe as repercussion. Who is the Minister of Defense in Ukraine is entirely an internal issue. So I don't think there was any pressure from EU or America. And since it's not connected to international funding, the protests could be ignored. And they seen after Syrsky was pushed out, they pretty much were. If you followed from Zelensky's official communication channels, after Syrsky was fired, there was no mention of the protests or anything. They might as well have not happened. The parliament was scheduled to show up on 18th. It did. The vote was scheduled on 19th. It was held. Hmara was voted in with 2 against votes. And that was that. So this protest unfortunately shows that if there isn't international pressure and the government decides to ignore the protests, it can. And we can't exactly escalate because that would hurt the defense effort and the nation and the country and so on, and put people's lives at risk. And that's an unfortunate issue. Same with elections. We can't hold them, but at the same time, the parliament is very much not acting independently and in crisis, and it needs change. We can't do change. It's an unfortunate dilemma. About the mood, there is a surge, there is disappointment, there is bitterness that people forgot that they got Syrsky out, honestly. You need to remind them, and they were like, oh yeah, we actually did a thing.
That's a pretty big thing. We do have to keep in mind that if we look at the Ministry of Defense right now, Fedorov's team is staying on in the absence of Fedorov himself, and quite frankly, Fedorov himself was always a part of that equation I was most questionable about, because I just don't trust tech bros in general. His team is still there, his initiatives are still there, Scalia is gone. These are some very
the Scalia
big things that
investigations
happened.
are an important part that people forget about, yes. Because it was a month ago, people generally have short attention spans. But because it was so long and the protests kept showing up, and for such a long period of time, there was this feeling that people are coming and there is no reaction. There is general disappointment and disbelief that something can be done. There is stubbornness in spite of that. And there are some people who are burnt out and they want to give it a rest. And they are arguing in the chat. I've been reading for the last 2 days. They're at each other's, not at each other's throats, but sometimes it gets heated.
So I think that's where we'll wrap off. Do you have any parting words for us?
Yeah, I had conflicts with foreign Ukraine supporters. That's an issue that was commonly described on the square, and I tend to agree that abroad people equate Zelensky and Ukraine and very much idealize him. They still live with this image of 2022 Zelensky, I need ammunition, not a ride, we'll be fighting back, glory to Ukraine, Zelensky here, Arachamia here, Yermak here, all that stuff. And so when people in Ukraine start voicing their concerns, their issues with their government, people from abroad start calling them like Russian assets or spies or traitors. And like, I guess, sit your ass down and listen or something. Like, don't create idols, don't build idols. It was a lesson that some protesters had to learn themselves, that they idealized Fedorov too much and he kind of stabbed them in the back. And so don't idealize political figures. Be for the people, for the movement, for the cause, not for the person. That's what I would like to spread as a message abroad.
Absolutely, absolutely. Zelensky is not Ukraine. He has had his strengths. He's very much had his weaknesses, but he is a politician, and as his political party would say, a servant of the people, not the leader of the people.
Yes, one of the chants was servant of the people, not a king.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for talking to us, Roma, and plug once again Patreon that you are a part of. Do you
Yes,
wanna-
exactly. Go pay Anthony so he can keep making this.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Wonderful. I hope that was enlightening to everyone, and it is very important to be listening to Ukrainian voices on these and other issues. And to wrap up this episode, of course, go for more information and resources regarding Ukraine. And I have a project that's going to expand on that idea coming forward, hopefully in September. It makes the most sense with back to school. Whatever, that's the teaser for it. The Patreon, again, patreon.com/Ukraine without hype. Join our list of subscribers and join our Discord channel to give your input and communicate in other ways about the program, what we want to do, give any feedback, ideas, what you want to learn about. It's always important. I want to know what you want to learn about at all times, because from here, a lot of things may seem obvious that are not actually so obvious. I'll be linking again my playlist of Ukrainian music if you want to experience that. That will go through the Spotify system. So if you're not listening on Spotify, it will not actually be linked. And as I said before the interview, I will be having that gear fundraiser coming up within the next week. And so to thank our great patrons who make this all possible, thank you very much to Randy McNerlin, the voices in my head are from Big Pharma, Kyle Smith, Damascus Medusa, Giorgio, David Shepard, Ivana Kukratskaya, Mike, Kevin Albertin, Michael Drucker, PLM, Arminius, T. Bart, Devi, Anonymous, Michael Wickman, Jenny Louise, Marguerite, Dmitry Litvin, Dennis Napalm, Vivek, James Burke, Allison Chainsaw, Big Mag, Elizabeth Hughes, Nick Niazin, Andy S., John Gates, Nicole Ford, Sanjay, Grace Krause, Laura De Leon, Had to Laugh, Jacob Poem, Chris Bennington, Livy Grove, James Wise, Alex Grochmal, Ada McDonald, Jerd, Victor Matei, Scott Tokaryuk, Etienne Saleh, Anastasia, Captain Tentacle, Evelyn, Veronica Aim, Julia Lindsay, Emily Bavona, Beyond Barbarossa Podcast, Anonymous, Subtle Knife, RDK, Tanya B., Lori Halila, Christopher Yee, Lemonikin, Demetrio, Ursula Zolenkoff, Noah Brown, Glowing Wind, Can Dystopian Fiction Please Remain Fiction, Marcus Nashkus, Andrew Glenn, Zay Perry, William Brown, Abel Lenz, Denna Jones, Joseph Verlone, Yellow Duck, Anonymous, Bucktron 2021, Florian Kunkel, Matthew Rowe, Bill, The Big Chinchilla Lobby, Hero, and Bill. Thank you all very much for your support. And until next week, Slava Ukraini.